like to look in a little more detail at, if you like, the alchemy of perception, or that transition, the process by which, in which we come to sense with soul, sense the world with soul, sense others and things of this world with soul. How that transformation of perception actually happens, some of the elements involved in that, how life becomes image, and to give some examples and kind of look at what's going on there. But before I do, something occurs to me, or I feel a bit impelled to say again something to perhaps reassure you. I don't know if that's needed, but as I said in the first talk, I feel like I'm treading a little bit of a tightrope between, on the one side, wanting to bring in a sense of precision and careful discernment and a kind of acuity of and refinement of attention and wisdom in terms of what's involved in all this business of imaginal perception, perceiving, imagining, sensing the soul, etc., on the one hand. And on the other hand, not wanting in that sort of careful delineation and examination of what's involved, not wanting, on the other hand, to discourage or make it kind of overly prohibitive or formulaic or too tightly circumscribed. So I really would like you to feel like you can jump in and play and experiment, and it doesn't have to be, am I getting it right? This kind of freeze, cramp that so often plagues meditators and people on different spiritual paths, but especially I find in some ways we teach insight meditation particularly, I seem to encounter that a lot. So I'm really wanting to kind of strike that balance and say a bit more that kind of helps you feel, hopefully, free in this process, free to play. So pointed out that when we talk about soul making and that whole kind of journey, if you like, or trajectory, direction of soul making, that what we're really talking about is a dynamic process. There's a dynamism involved. In fact, there's all kinds of dynamism involved in soul making, so that eros itself is a dynamic movement towards wanting more, etc., or of bringing something towards us and opening to it, whatever. There's a dynamism there. There's a dynamism in what we kind of described as the very soul-making dynamic, the eros-psyche-logos process, the way they get involved with each other, inseminate each other, fill each other out, complicate, enrich, widen, deepen, all that. There's what I mentioned, I think, in the end of the last part of this talk, there's the kind of process involved in that soul-making will give birth to discernments, discriminations, distinctions, delineations in both our conception and our perception of all kinds of elements of experience, emotional, material, sensory, intellectual, you name it, in terms of the logos, the conceptual framework. And the very making of some discernments and distinctions and refinements of delineation also feeds the soul-making process. There's a kind of dynamism involved in that, all kinds of dynamism involved in the soul-making movement. And I would say dynamic responsiveness, if you like, the ability to, like we talked about, that hawk kind of gliding on the thermal air currents, and the ability to kind of respond to what's happening, to dance with what's happening in the being, in the perception, in the body, in the totality of that, and move in response to that very dynamically, very beautifully. That dynamic responsiveness is also an element of soul making. However, when I say all that and imply all that, that there's a dynamism involved, what we're talking about is dynamic processes involved in soul making, one also has to consider the time frames of what we're talking about. So if something is dynamic, it can be dynamic, with a very sudden, dramatic shift of something bursting into consciousness, or a sudden change of responsiveness that's happening in the moment. Or it can be dynamic in a very very almost imperceptible way over time to build up a change. Or it can be dynamic in stages, in the sense we kind of plateau for a while, if you want to use that word. It's not the best word, but let's say things look relatively static for a while. They're being consolidated. We're steadying with something, and then something suddenly shatters or just gradually changes. So one has to look at the kind of temporal styles, or different temporal characteristics of the way change happens. So dynamic response of dynamism doesn't mean that there's always change happening. It's always rapid change, and we're always like, things are always exploding or kind of moving rapidly. Sometimes it's periods like that, and sometimes it's much characterized by different what would you call it, kind of trajectories of change, or there's a word for it, graph of change or whatever. So, for example, and I did already touch on this when we talked about the eros-psyche-logos dynamic in the last part of this talk, we said they actually have different lability, if that's the word. They're labile in different ways, they're changeable in different ways. Logos tends to change more slowly over time, or we need to kind of consolidate a conceptual framework or just a new idea, get used to it over quite some time usually, and then something might shatter or change. Or in time, with practice, there's this ability to shift it quite rapidly, deliberately. So we can say Logos is involved in sensing with soul. In other words, there's always a concept happening. There's always a conceptual framework being engaged when we're sensing with soul. It's not a non-conceptual experience. But the sort of expansion or stretching or shattering of a logos is something that's usually kind of more gradual, slower over time. It's less labile as one of the elements in that trinity than say eros. So we already made that point as an example. Then, for example, another example would be, we talked about the movement, the organic movement, if we're not blocking it, for the soul-making dynamic to sort of spread from not just the erotically imaginal object or other, but also, so to speak, back towards the self and the elements of the self, and also out towards the world. And that what can be very helpful at times is kind of attending to that particular trinity there, self, other, world, and just allowing that to be, or encouraging that to be more balanced, the soul-making spreading in a more balanced direction at times. But even saying that, it doesn't mean it always needs to be balanced. I always need to make sure that self, other, world are equally balanced in this soul-making situation to the same, the same degree or intensity of soul-making that's spreading equally in all directions. No, the whole thing is fluid. So sometimes we're much more with one of those three, much more than the other two. And it may be that we actually need to dwell more with certain poles there, in that, if we just stay with that self, other, world trinity there. We could add eros to that and make it a quaternity, self, other, world, eros. But in terms of what becomes, if you like, an object of soul-making, becomes taken up by the soul-making process and becomes an erotic, imaginal object for us. But maybe we need to dwell with one of those poles, if you like, of that pattern. So, for example, habitually we might not. The soul-making process might not come back to ourselves, if you like. We're always, and I've mentioned this before, it's possible to always see the divinity, the beauty, etc., in the other, in the imaginal object, and habitually, for different reasons, it doesn't come back to the self, or we're blocking it coming back to the self, we're just neglecting to look there. And through the looking, through the noticing, allowing it to ignite the self as a erotically imaginal object for ourselves. So that might be a habit, and so we might need to linger a little bit with the self as image and stay there and kind of be a bit imbalanced the other way for a while, because it's countering our habit. Or it could be the other way around, that we're always with the self, and we're in situations where we forget to kind of see, what's happening with my perception of the other at the moment, and letting that become more imaginal. So, in working with different people, I see people have different habits here, and sometimes, if I'm working with them, I need to kind of just gently remind, what about that? Can you notice what's happening there? Yeah, something opens, the water spreads in that direction to balance things out, and that helps the whole soul-making process. Or it might be, for example, that in the soul-making or in the sensing of soul, that we need at times or stages in our practice to give more attention to the bodily experience, the energy body experience in what's going on, because that's actually not become something that's just kind of second nature to us, to notice what's going on with the energy body. So actually to give more attention to that, or we lose touch with that in our sort of fascination, erotic fascination with the other. We go out. Hence the exercises on two-ness, or part of the reasons for the exercise on two-ness that we were doing on some of the recent retreats. So we may need to linger more with the energy body and really get used to what it is to pay attention in a way that brings the energy body alive. That in itself can take months and often years. It's really a journey for people. It's not, as I've pointed out before, it doesn't just equate with mindfulness of the body. It opens up the experience of mindfulness of the body, it opens up the wavelengths of that much more broadly. And again, within that, we may be so used to, in attending to the energy body, or in the energy body experience, our habit may be that it's always very solid. Like it's always just the sensations of the bum on the cushion or the chair, or very kind of gross level, solid level sensations. And we need to get used to, and this can take some time, this sort of the much finer range of the spectrum, where things are much more kind of ethereal, and the sense of the body as a kind of luminous space of refined vibration, or vice versa. That's someone's habitual default, and they need to kind of get used to the more solid, earthy kind of sense of the energy body. Or again, in terms of, if you like, energies and body, someone might be, again, for lots of different reasons, might be that different kinds of resonances and movements and feeling energy in certain areas of the body, for instance, the heart area can be very sensitive there. But when it comes to the hips or the kind of sexual energy, it's a bit kind of cut off, or it's just a bit frozen, or it doesn't fill out there, and so there might be a period where that fills out more, or again vice versa, that actually the heart and the whole heartfulness and how that movement of emotionality fills out with the energy body is not something that a person is used to attending to. And again, just extrapolating from that, maybe within the whole kind of I've already said it, really just dwelling more with the emotions as the kind of pole of what one's paying attention to within the whole imaginal constellation. Maybe for some people at certain stages in their practice really what they lean towards over and over, and that might be very important as a kind of growth. Or we get this sense of the imaginal and the whole soul-making thing, and it's always kind of habitually very nicey. It's always kind of white-robed angels of light, etc., and very kind of ethereal in the texture of the images, etc. And there's less of the dark gods, and maybe or again vice versa. It's all a bit dark and filled with dukkha and angst and kind of or dark in lots of different ways, perhaps sexually or whatever. And there needs to be that opening out of the sort of the more obviously the more traditional kind of etheric, beneficent, angelic, light, luminous, refined presences. Again, what's the habit? What's needed? Or, as I've also noticed recently, the whole realm of desire, that, for many people, it's actually not okay to have desire. And that can be a kind of cultural transmission in terms of the wider culture. It can be an early religious transmission or something in the family or the schooling or in the Dharma teaching, that even just kind of allowing one's desire and allowing one's eros, if we talk about the opening to the current of desire practice or just the awareness of eros in the imaginal practices, that there might be a period where one's just learning to notice desire, actually feel it, what it feels like, and allow it, and be okay with it, and then even recognize it as a lovely thing and a beautiful thing, and that can increase all the way to sensing it, as I've explained in the Eros Unfettered talks, sensing it as a divine thing, our desire, divine desire. So that might be a whole way that the dynamic needs to, or the constellation needs to be kind of weighted for some people, maybe for a while, So talked about balance and all these elements, etc., but there's still also the individual kind of growth or development of a soul, if you like it, if you like as an expression. So what is habit that we need to kind of address? Oh yeah, that always happens. I always neglect to do this, and it's just a little shift or a little shift of attention that allows it to break out of our normal habit. Sometimes these habits are not, oh, that's terrible, that's going to take me decades to, it's like it's just a shift, and then, there, it's moved right there in the moment. I mean, the habit might still be a little bit entrenched, but the actual shifting of it is not such a big deal in a lot of cases. Or it may be a little more involved. We may need to look at some of the, for instance, with the desire thing. Well, what are the sort of murky beliefs that I have absorbed from my education, from my culture, from Dharma culture sometimes, that kind of just block off, inhibit and disallow my desire and my kind of celebration of the beauty of that, etc., or even that possibility. So that's the question: what's habit? What does it need? And what is kind of given by soul to me? So it's given that this particular, say, complex emotion needs lingering with, or this say bandwidth of the energy body spectrum needs lingering with. It's given to me by, let's say, it's given to me by soul as part of my soul making, my soul education. So that becomes what's given by soul and what is purely habit. What is needed here? And I'm not saying these are necessarily easy questions, but just to have that kind of light inquiry rather than a kind of formulaic approach to all this, questions of balance and dynamism and what needs to be happening and what should be happening and all that. And then also, what's just a personal soul style, a personal kind of way that my soul is, or way that your soul is, that needs respecting. Some people have more darkness in the beautiful sense of the word, beautiful, rich darkness than others. It's part of their soul makeup. Some people do have much more facility, let's say, with the ethereal than with the sort of denser realms. Some people do have just more sexual libido and eros than others, and this is all needs to be respected. So what's personal soul style that needs to be respected? What's habit and kind of indoctrination or just incrustation by habit? What is given to me by soul, and what is actually needed? So all this, again, very light, very open, playful. Don't be afraid of making mistakes with this. Mistakes are, as Miles Davis used to say, I've forgotten what he used to say, but you'll make mistakes, don't fear them. It's not a big deal. Mistake is something to be responded to. Oh yeah, okay, it's part of the dynamic responsiveness. So, I really want to encourage that sense of playing. And that kind of permission and freedom to, as I said, just dive in and play, And then, actually, even that I'm going to qualify later, but let's just say that for now. All this talk of dynamism and dynamics is intimately associated with pacing, and pacing, I think, was something I talked about, if I remember, in the Path to the Imaginal retreat. Again, I know where there's a lot of kind of aspects to all this and information being put out, so it might well have been something you just got lost in the sort of in the amount of material being communicated. But pacing in regards to a particular image, how much do I stay with this one image and call it back deliberately, or just let it move on in itself, transform, or bring another image in, or look for another image, or whatever. So these are questions that I've gone into before, but there's also questions of pacing now we're bringing in relation to these elements and this whole sense of dynamism itself. How quickly do we move through logoi, for instance, this breaking of the vessels that I've been talking about in several retreats. It's not that vessels can break all the time. There needs to be times of building vessels, building structures, understanding conceptual frameworks, really absorbing them, digesting them, making them work for us, really getting the juice out of them, the mileage out of them, and then maybe there's breaking vessels or stretching or additioning or whatever, or questioning. So there's pacing in all this, pacing questions, discernments to make in all this talk of dynamism with regard to the different elements. And then also, and I've say so much, and I still will continue to say a lot about this business of reification and how important this middle way of the imaginal is, or the theatre kind of quality or element of the whole sensing the soul and imaginal. It is more complicated than all that, but I think what I want to, which I will return to, but what I want to say right now is that, look, and I've said it before, I think it was the end of the re-enchanting retreat, I think, look, it is a big deal, this reification business, and it is often the element that is kind of at the root of problems that we encounter when we try these practices, and it feels like, well, it kind of exploded, or I went into a brick wall, or something went wrong, or the soul making is stuck. It is, or there's dukkha coming in rather than a kind of opening of the soul-making process, or things are not kind of fully imaginal, authentically imaginal in the way that we described in the first talk of this series. It is often a reification that's kind of at the root of that of what's going on there, and one can kind of trace it back and see, oh yes, I'm reifying something or other here, or quite a lot of things. That is the case, and it is really important. But also, we don't want to be the kind of reification police. Thou shalt not reify is the first command. We don't, it's like, expect to reify. Look, it's a human, to me, that's, if you like, that goes with the first noble truth. That there is dukkha. Dukkha arises. It's like dukkha rests on reification. And so we will do that. We will reify, expect to reify. And again, in the context of what I'm trying to say right now in this little fragment here is, don't get too hung up on all this. Sometimes it's necessary to reify something, and maybe for a while, and there can still be a lot of soul making, let's say, that happens in a reified perspective. So it is a big deal, but you don't need to kind of get frozen in this, oh my goodness, what happens if I reify? Or so the whole thing gets stuck that way. Expect that you will reify. It's probably it's quite a maturity to really kind of whittle that down so that it tends to happen less and less. But it is a big deal, but don't kind of get too hung up on it. So we really don't want to be the reification police with this, and we don't want you to be the reification police with respect to yourselves. And so just finally for right now, I feel like kind of whatever I say in all this, trying to make these delineations, trying to say things, do you see how this is working? It's like this, or it has this element and not that, or this rather than that, and it must include this, and whatever I say, whatever we say in kind of trying to provide a framework and a platform for all these explorations. There's going to be exceptions. I'm beginning to think it's like, so that there will be possible exceptions. It's more like teaching this stuff. I feel like it's more like teaching art or teaching music. It's like, yeah, it's really important. You learn kind of rules of harmony and kind of things to look out for, and when you're improvising, and different ways you can do things, and did you think about this, or you can explore this, and don't forget this, and all that. But whatever one says as a teacher, I think, or whatever one is told as a teacher, there are exceptions possible, and someone can just give an example of exactly an exception to what you've just kind of explained, and the opposite of it. That doesn't mean, though, that all that explanation, that delineation, and the exploration of those delineations and those refinements of perception, and those conceptions and conceptual frameworks is irrelevant just because there are exceptions. So again, I feel there's this kind of tightrope's too dramatic a metaphor, but there's a kind of balance and a kind of looseness with precision that's involved in this, a looseness with a kind of precision of discernment and refinement and attention. So again, I'm kind of inserting this fragment at this point just because it occurred to me, and because I really I want to encourage and not discourage. So I hope that that's helpful.
Thank you for listening. To learn how you can support the teachers and Dharma Seed, please visit dharmaseed.org.